Welcome to the Sports Ethics Show. The Sports Ethics Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. I am Shawn Klein, the sports ethicist. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and on Twitter at Sports Ethicist. You can email the show, sportsethicist@gmail.com. This podcast is a recording of the interviews with the participants in the 4th Annual Rockford University Sport Studies Symposium. So it was recorded on April 24th, 2015, following the symposium on the campus of Rockford University. The theme of the conference was Sport Studies, the State of the Art, and so we had 6 scholars come in and talk to us about various aspects of sports studies. What is it? How does it relate to other disciplines? And so the podcast consists of first my colleague and I, Mike Perry, sitting down with the first panel, talking about the nature of sports studies itself, and then a conversation with the second panel, which looked at some of the interdisciplinary issues in sports studies. So I'm sitting here with the first panel from today's Sport Studies Symposium. Matt Adamson is a PhD MD student in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health and also at the College of Medicine at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Stephen Mosher is a professor of sport management and media in the School of Health Sciences and Human Performance at Ithaca College. Dr. Synthia Syndor earned her PhD in her interdisciplinary humanities at Pennsylvania State University, and she is now an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So what we're going to do is just have a conversation about some of the topics that were in the first panel that focused on sports studies really as sports studies qua sports studies, to really go to my Aristotelian roots. And so Matt, you spoke about how sports studies maybe could be a bridge between play studies and science study, and in particular you focused on the common dichotomy of work and play, and your talk looked to challenge that. I thought that was very interesting, and I thought maybe you could also say a little bit about what the goal is in terms of pushing on that dichotomy and why we should think about pushing on it.
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, the idea behind sort of trying to problematize the work-play dichotomy is just that the way we look at things, if we're looking at them in terms of this dichotomy, it sort of precludes us from seeing what we're looking at in certain ways. So if we're looking at something as work, we won't see it in terms of play, and thus there are certain aspects of that thing that we're looking at that we just won't see. And so I think like play studies, sports studies, I think it gives us a really sort of interesting lens where we are really invested in play and sport in sort of this play sense, but also in this broader significance where these things can do some sort of like social cultural work. Mm-hmm. And so the idea then being that if we can start to break down some of these barriers between these terms and ideas that we're thinking about, that we might be able to make connections that we're not able to make at this point, or maybe be able to argue more strongly for the significance of things like sport and play in the broader, social world.
So a quick follow-up then is, do you have a concrete example of an insight that we might miss if we don't, because we're trapped in this dichotomy? Is there some insight that we would miss that this is going to show us, and be more concrete about it?
Sure. Yeah. So I think in the talk I brought up the example of Bo Lotto, who was a scientist who studies perception, and he tried to get at this idea of, can children do science, right? So he's operating from this assumption that science is a lot like play. They share a lot of the same characteristics. So in doing that, he really illuminated some of the aspects of science as play that relate more broadly to broader critiques of science. So critiques dealing with science in terms of trying to make science more open, trying to make it more diverse, more reflexive and critical about its own processes and the knowledge production that goes on there. And he talked about how trying to look at science as play helps us to structure it in a way where we are more aware of the process. We're more aware of the process of learning. He termed it as seeing ourselves see. That when we do it in this way, we can see the way we see things. We can see the process of learning and the process of producing knowledge. So it's just a small example, but basically that example I think illustrates how breaking down this distinction where science isn't only work, it's also play, can help us to do the scientific work in ways that might be more open, more explorative and less exploitative, more these things that have been really broad critiques of science for a while now.
So a question that just popped in my head as you're talking,
Sure.
And as the host, I'll take my prerogative.
Yeah.
Is it particularly in the lotto example? Is there any discussion or connections to Montessori? Because there's a kind of Montessorian sort of element there of allowing children to explore the world and really be little scientists. I think she even uses a similar kind of term in her writings. Do you see any of that, or is that just
no? I definitely think so, and I don't think he's necessarily making those connections, but I think his broader sort of vision or goal really relates well to that. This idea of really putting like humans and children, adults in this broader context of like a world that we're a part of, that we're not just sort of in control of everything, that we can be less exploitative, like he was saying, and just more exploratory, seeing ourselves as part of this broader sort of relational framework. And so I think, in terms of the Montessori approach, I really do feel like that's sort of maybe another application of this idea. So he's not necessarily speaking about it in those terms, but I think the consequences and his sort of goals really relate.
Well, the idea of having the child sort of not just be instrumental towards the adult, but have their own life as well, and their own goals within being a child. The goal of the child, as Montessori puts it, is to become the adult, but that's within their life structure at that point,
right.
And that's what they're focused on.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways it really helps us to sort of give more. I think understand like childhood more broadly, in the sense that children know more than we might think that they do, and have more capacities and skills than we see if we think of them, as this sort of childish, playful, in this sort of childish, playful way. So,
Great. So, Stephen, you told us about the history of sports studies. It was a bit gloomy in some ways. So, I was hoping maybe we could focus more on the positive side, on the side of hope here, and what sort of what things might be developing that might be more positive about the study of sport, whether it's within the confines of sport studies per se, or maybe just within the academy in general.
Sure. That's a difficult question, given that the past 35 years in higher education has seen an incredibly long and powerful assault on the liberal arts. And I don't see much hope, sorry, that is going to can dissipate any time in the near future. So sports studies scholars in particular have to be in the academy very, very strategic about where they locate themselves. And that's difficult, very much so. At my college, I think the best place for our program to be would be in the School of Communications, because it's the only place where there's this willingness to consider both the liberal arts and pre-professional studies as having legitimacy. Our humanities and sciences faculty look at sports studies much the way it's looked at in many universities, and that is it's the toy department of life. It doesn't have any significance, and this is astounding to me given that there's a 60-year body of knowledge that's been produced. But that's the way it has been and continues at most colleges. And I don't think sports studies is helped by being allied completely and totally with pre-professional programs like schools of business, which is where most sport management programs have gone. And I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to be allied with schools of allied health because the liberal arts don't have the same kind of cachet that the natural sciences do, even out there in the for-profit world. So either schools of communication, which some universities don't have, or some liberal arts colleges don't have, or really, hopefully, a workable way in which interdisciplinary studies can be organized with the support of administration, because without that support, you're just going to be, 5 people in a room 6 times a year talking about how do we get this class promoted and how do we get that class promoted, and how do kids see that there's actually a minor that can be done, or at my college, a major. I think the biggest challenge is to be able to convince the people who control the purse strings that classes that always fill up, it doesn't matter what department they're offered in, they always max out with students, that they should be valued for that, and generating FTEs it really matters in colleges today. So just because it has sport in it does not mean that it can't be productive in helping a kid make decisions about where their careers are going to go. And
well, you speak of the assault on liberal arts that is probably as old as the liberal arts, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that I'm hopeful about sports studies, generically, not necessarily as a minor at a
Sure.
college, but the study of sport is a possible bulwark against that attack, as a way, because I see sport as, we were talking about this earlier today, as a kind of integrative field or integrative activity that brings so much of the liberal arts together. Just like we saw today, law, classics, religion, history, philosophy, sociology, all the different disciplines seem to come to bear in this human activity. And so it seems like, in some ways, a perfect avenue for engaging the liberal arts in a way that maybe isn't directly calling it liberal arts, that has this cachet for bringing students in, that the students are interested
Yes.
in it in a way that they might not be interested in the liberal arts if sold that way or presented that way. And so the students are interested, and then there are definable career paths, which is something that some people are going to be interested in, whereas philosophy, what are you going to do with a philosophy major? My standard response is anything you want, right? Which is another way of saying nothing. But right, and so I see. So I guess my question to you is: do you see that as a possibility of using the popularity of sport as a way of convincing administration to and other faculty to sort of slip back into the liberal arts?
I do see that as a possibility, but it's going to require the cooperation of the world of mediated sport out there. So the fact that ESPN's Outside the Lines actually has grown some legs in the past few years, and while it claims to be powerfully important, it continues to reify most of the belief systems that are out there. But every once in a while, it does some important stuff. Brian Gumbel's Real Sports. Every cable network seems to have this kind of a show now that brings the discussion into the homes of regular folks, and I think that's really important. Even something as horrifying as Friday Night Tykes on Spike Network, looking at youth football, or what was the one this year, Bad Coaches. I mean, it's terrible television, but not if it actually gets people invested in the discussions that are really, really important, as opposed to, okay, we're going to have a football team that's going to generate this amount of dollars and the university is going to be all wonderful, when the research shows that doesn't happen, except at maybe 2 or 3 colleges in the country. But hey, I teach a course called Youth Sport in America, and it essentially is my attempt to, behind the cloak of an academic class, get my students ready for parenthood. And so while they're taking this class as 18, 19-year-olds, they consider most of what I talk about as, Mosher, you're full of, you can fill in the blank. But then, one of the great rewards of, I'm sure anybody who teaches in the liberal arts is, 15 years later, I've been in this field a long time, I get an email from out of the blue, and this happens 2 or 3 times a year. Dear Dr. Mosher, you don't remember me, but I took this class, Youth Sport in America, and I got to tell you, I thought you were completely full of you-know-what. But I just want to let you know, my 13-year-old daughter just came home from volleyball practice, and she told me this story. So we went down to the school, and we had a meeting with, and I just wanted to let you know that I should have paid more attention 18 years ago, because you were right. That's the ultimate vindication, is that the liberal arts eventually come to that you come to the point where you appreciate the liberal arts, usually on your deathbed. Did I live a good life or did I not live a good life? Right. All the rest of the way, it's out there in the margins. But yeah, if we can bring that actually to practical, everyday lived lives, and not hide behind academic lingo so much, we'll be better off. And I think that the administrators will see that and perhaps even support it.
Well, I always have a couple students in my sports ethics class that have no interest in sport per se. They're taking it, it's a requirement, they need some ethics class, or their boyfriend or whatever is someone who's into sport and they need to figure it out, something like that, right? And so there's always a couple of them, and they're always in some ways the most interesting students to have, because they have an outsider's perspective, and but then they also so they help us understand what we're doing better.
Absolutely.
But then, in terms of what you were saying, there's also a sense of which then they begin to see that this isn't just who got the most points and that there is something deep and profound going on in these activities and in thinking about and enjoying the activities.
It's very much a shared community experience that we have too little of in our fragmented society. Mm-hmm. From my experience, the best students are the ones who know nothing about sport, because they don't come in with their fanboy or their fangirl, ideologies and preconceptions. Then, after those are the students who are really difficult to deal with, because most everything that research says stands in opposition to what they believe, and it's a struggle for us in the classroom. But it's always great when I have at least a third of the class is female, as opposed to one female standing there with 19 guys, and it's even better when some of the guys and the females know nothing about sport, because they can look at this phenomenon through a different lens, and it's very, very helpful.
So, Synthia, you discussed how maybe getting a better grip on, a better understanding of the origin or the essence of sport could help guide the study of sport and give us some sense of maybe a better way of thinking about it. And you talked a lot about how it's a kind of ritualization. So could you say more about that? About in what sense is it a ritualization, and what that might mean, and how that might get us to understand sport better?
Yeah. By ritualization, I meant not like repetitive actions, like you might have a ritual before a game or anything, but I used it from a lot of ritual studies in anthropology, in which it's understood that ritual is symbolic. So I was using some important works that hadn't really considered sport in the way I did, and to put them together to say sport is the ritual sacrifice of physical energy. That came from classicist David Sansone's book. And he says that sport is innate to us because the energy invested in Paleolithic hunting went on for so long and was so intense that when hunting was no longer necessary to communities because they're stratified and bigger and so on, that humans still had this biocultural thing about them that they needed to give up that energy, but it's symbolic, and that to do that they started sporting and using a lot of the symbols, motifs, the expenditure of energy that had been used in hunting in sport then. So that's
and now and also one of the issues that you pushed on in your talk was the purported aspirational or idealizational role of sport. The idea of it being a tool for peace, a tool for building community, a tool for coming together, and those kinds of things that often gets pushed at. So I guess probably my question I wanted to ask in the Q&A, but I figured we'd have this space to ask it, is there no aspirational role then in sport, or is it just that we've overblown it in the contemporary marketing of sport? Yeah. So is it that there's no space for it, or is it that that it's just overblown?
Yeah, my idea is that we modern humans sense and understand there's something so crucial and important about sport, and if we agree with my hypothesis, it's because it's something that for this long period of human activity we were involved in. So because we understand it innately as something really important, we moderns have mistakenly attached it to all of these other things like morals. Well, that's sort of right, because the best hunters were sleeping the night before and really caring about the hunt and so on. Morals, leadership, peace, I think that's an artificial kind of selected, invented thing that we're attaching to sport. And I then, in my work, was using other critiques about sincerity in the philosophical sense to critique how we think sport is peace, but it's really not something that comes with sport. That instead, in sport, you stay in your ritual boundaries and you're not going to merge them or blend them. But the best you can do is be next to another person. So you might have a feel-good essence about that or sense, but we're mistaking it for all these other grandiose ideas, or so I argue.
I mean, and I could definitely see that in terms of looking at sport as necessarily bringing that about as being wrong, because there's plenty of counterexamples to that sport being used as a tool of oppression, as a tool of separation. But I also do see some of these aspirational examples of sport as helping break down some barriers and not achieving world peace, right? But of helping move us one step closer, bringing people together, allowing them to see themselves differently. So as you say, kind of you bring us to the boundaries. We don't necessarily cross over, but if we start to see each other across that boundary, then maybe that gives us the space to begin to cross over. So you use Israelis and Palestinians, or the Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, or Jackie Robinson in the U.S., and Stephen, your wife brought up Sandy Koufax, right? And these different points in sport that do suggest some aspirational role. Maybe that's not its origin, and it's not a necessary component to it, but that it does have some of that role. I think. Right? I want to at least suggest that it can have that, but we have to also be careful with it, because we can overdo it and then it just becomes schlock and saccharine.
But what I say is that sport can do those things, but so can other things.
Absolutely.
When people are next to each other, whatever it is. A bunch of people who don't know each other go on a trip, or they make art, or they build a well.
Absolutely.
But we specifically have these initiatives now, policies and funding for sport as helping with development and peace and so on. And I think that, like, I've been trying to look through UN documents and so on, and even those writers and the documents themselves admit we don't have empirical evidence on this. We don't, but we sense that this is about these things.
It's a nice story that we keep telling ourselves over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't have any problem with just being satisfied with the fact that everybody together is having a real good time doing something that occasionally rises to being beautiful, and just celebrating that. What the heck is wrong with that? Going to a good ball game, playing in a good ball game, shooting the arrow perfectly once every 72 times. That's fabulous stuff, and it helps us connect with our basic humanness, and in a way that happens more often than in other activities where we try to achieve that, because it's a lot easier to get good at sport than it is to get good at music or art or those other activities.
And the spectator component is so much broader. I mean, people will go to the ballet, will go to the opera, but not at the same rate, not at the same level, and it's not as accessible to audiences the way sport can be, and they can begin to enjoy this moment, this beautiful moment together, and realize, well, you're black, I'm white, you're Jewish, you're Catholic, but we're both enjoying this thing, and recognizing that there's a shared goal is one. Now, it's not gonna suddenly, peace break out and everyone love each other, but it's one brick in the wall that's coming down, and I think that's it's okay to recognize that, and to recognize that it doesn't necessarily have to have that role to be good either.
That's right.
That's what these ritual scholars say, that it's like a dance, and you're not going to change religions or whatever through it. But I think what you're saying, that it does bring people together in some ways, is speaks to the importance of it as not just some other frivolous thing or just one other cultural form, but something really serious, which makes our venture in understanding it, and
it could be just as simple as a little gesture with two joggers meeting on the street. Hey, how you doing? They're sharing this activity. Nothing could be more wonderful from my perspective, living where I live, where the ice is 17 feet thick most of the year. Both runners at the same time approaching a puddle from the opposite directions, and both having the impulse to jump in it. Because that's what you do with puddles when you're out jogging in late March in the Northeast. There's a puddle, let's stomp on it.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's, when you showed up today and you had a wonderful tie on, and it's a Boston Red Sox tie, I saw that, and immediately there's a connection there. So that can be bad too, in the sense of if we tribalize that, then that can be problematic. But it's also a nice moment of a sharing of a kind of community and shared values as well.
Let me jump in real quick, because there was a question I wanted to ask you guys at the end of the thing, and I waited until we got here, but it was almost as if my question started and it got more complicated as each one now goes back, and it has to do with the hunting aspect of it, like the hunting ritual. And I was thinking back to my own. I've had a yearly tradition with my father. He comes up when we go pheasant hunting, and I'm thinking, to what extent is this play? Is this work? And the concept of, or is it a ritual? And there's so many ritual aspects to the hunting experience that I have, that I've had growing up, and that I have with my parents. Now, if it was straight out feeding myself, it becomes a matter of more work. And I'm thinking then ancient, and you're talking about the hunting ritual, and to what extent was this seen as work, or was it seen as play, or does the ritual aspect combine those two elements? And would that ritual aspect be interesting, how that would affect your paper? And then the concept of the classes from sports management to sports studies, and this idea that when it's connected to work, that's where it's seen as more legitimate, and what's connected to play, it's not. And again, what role does that ritual play in that? I think that's a question.
And that was something that I kind of wanted to put in the conversation, is that I think I don't know if it's important, but it's just interesting that we do have the dichotomy to begin with, right? So if we're talking about sport in this sense of being aspirational, it is interesting that this activity that can be so conceived as innocent, right? That might be one of the reasons why it is so appealing, and why it is a way, an arena where people can come together, where there are other activities or arenas where we just absolutely can't mix, right? And so I think that's something, at least where I would sort of problematize what I'm talking about, is that there might be some utility to maintaining the distinction, that there may be some things that, if we think of sport and play as sort of innocent, even though we know that they're not, and there's lots of scholarship to say otherwise, but that just this conception of that may facilitate certain things that we're also invested in, and that serve ends that we might not be so, that we would like to see happen. So I think sort of like I said in the panel discussion earlier, just that I don't know if I would want to dissolve the distinction completely. simply because I feel like there are aspects of both of them as separate that we definitely capitalize on and utilize and benefit from. So,
I'd like to get back to tribalism.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything wrong with tribalism, even at its most intense, as long as the people who are engaged in the tribalism know that it's tribalism. And so the phrase I use for podcasts and telephone radio interviews is that I say this is soap opera for men. And in soap operas or in any form of melodrama, you take the emotions of fear and pity and turn them into irrational fear and self-pity. So in 2003, even though you're in Rockford, Illinois, and I'm in upstate New York, we both had the same horror.
I was in Phoenix at the time.
Okay, you're in Phoenix. Yeah, Phoenix. Okay, so it was more like daytime for you. It was midnight for you. But when Aaron Boone hit this home run, our worlds just collapsed.
You didn't say the name of Aaron
Boone.
Boone.
All right, yeah, it's your podcast.
Yeah.
But the whole thing just went out of us. And yet at the same time, I'm thinking, I went into class the next day, I said, do you know how brave it is to be a knuckleball pitcher in that moment and throw that ball out into destiny like Tim Wakefield did? Think about how beautiful a moment that was for him. Now, the tribalism part, of course, came to its rightful conclusion 12 months later when the Red Sox literally came back from the dead, And I'm teaching in upstate New York, so I've got 30 kids in a 40-person class, and they are ripping me to shreds. Die, Mosher, die! You're going down, and it was all fun.
Yeah.
It was all games. But I can tell you this: I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the night before. Our teaching was terrible during those that series.
I canceled a few classes.
You canceled a few classes, and I've never done this in my entire life as a teacher, but I came in the next morning and I had a quiz, a true-false quiz for my students, and I told them to take it. First question was, the Boston Red Sox won the AL championship, and there was no false chance. It was just true. There were 4 questions like that, and I said, it's okay, you can circle it. I'm giving you an A, 100. And Yankee fans are going,
Awesome.
But they did it. And I said, maybe you need some music to be able to get through this moment, so I put on Sweet Caroline for them.
And he's a Cardinal fan. So
I'm just staying quiet.
But it's all fun.
Yeah.
It's all games. It's all wonderful. And can that build world peace or tear down barriers? Well, maybe it can. Yeah. But if we take it too seriously and actually have agendas that, we're going to fly these soccer teams over there and it's going to solve the border war, that's insanity. Yeah. That's not going to do it.
Well, your discussion ties together a lot, I think, because the play, in a way, is ritualizing some of these other emotions and these conflicts in a way that can denature them, or in a way of maybe taking some of the claws out of it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people talk about sport hate, and so we hate each other, but it's sport hate, which is a way of saying we don't really hate each other. We're playing at hating each other, or we're ritualizing this us versus you, but it's not real. And so we're able to put it into that space, and I think that makes it safer and allows us to deal with it in the same way that maybe having violence contained in a boxing ring is better than just fighting it on the street.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being part of the Sport Studies Symposium today, and look forward to some conviviality a little bit later after this.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, now we're sitting with the second panel from today's Sports Study Symposium. And this was focused more on actual interdisciplinary studies. So we had philosophy of law, we had classics, we had theology, and so we'll continue that discussion here. Now, Dr. Aaron Harper, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at West Liberty University in Wheeling, West Virginia, and Dr. Stephanie Quinn, Associate Professor of Classic Studies here at Rockford University, and Zach Smith, a graduate student in Sports Studies at the United States Sports Academy, and that's in Alabama, right? Yeah. And so now, Aaron, going in order of the talks this afternoon. You talked about interpretivism, certain theories of understanding sport, one being interpretivism and some of the issues with that, and then proposing legal realism as a possible alternative way of understanding sport. So could you say a little bit about why legal realism is a better way to explain sport?
So I think the attempt to use legal theories to understand sport makes sense because each of them seem to be rule-based systems that focus on adjudication and that sort of thing. And one of the virtues of these theories should be that they give us some advice, right, to a coach, an umpire, a referee, a commissioner, somebody like that. It should say something about how they ought to look at these cases. And essentially my concern is that while I like that idea, I think it doesn't always explain what actually is going on in sports. So, I mean, one of my basic suggestions is we have to look at sport as it's actually practiced if we're going to understand the subject matter, rather than getting into conversations about what it might look like or what it could look like. So that's more or less why I want to look at it from this legal realist perspective, is to look at sport as a practice, as it's done by players, rather than approaching it from a theoretical position that might tell us something about sport, but not really get at what's going on in sport.
Mm-hmm. Now, so one possible concern about that approach might be, and this may be falling into the conventional criticism of it, is that it becomes self-justifying in terms of some of the activities. It makes it hard to critique it from outside the practice. So have you thought about that possible objection? What are your answers to that?
Right. I think this is a serious concern because we don't want to say something like, well, this is the way it's done in sport. Stop right there. That's right. The end of the story. But
that's the way our students deal with it.
Right.
Often.
This is often the discussions we have in my philosophy of sport classes, and I'm sure in your classes as well. This is the system. We're all trying to win. There's not really any other level of analysis. So a couple of proposals I make in the paper, and these aren't fully developed yet. I think we can look at this from a sort of theoretical pragmatist perspective, that there are broader social ends, broad conception of fairness, and we might be able to say, to at least put some constraint on what we can do, right? That not just anything goes, that we should see sports like law and other sorts of disciplines in the service of larger ends. At the very least, I'd like to think that could say something about sportsmanship. I mean, while I'm skeptical of some moral claims about sports, at the very least, I want to say something about what kinds of actions might be unsportsmanlike and where we draw the line. Mm-hmm. So that's one suggestion. I think another way we might look at it is thinking of the virtues of the people who are making these decisions, right? So if we look at who is sanctioning people in sport, right? We have umpires and referees, we have coaches, commissioners, fans, other players, that sort of thing. And in some of these jobs, and to use the philosophical term, I think you need practical wisdom. Mm-hmm. In order to look at the facts of the case and make fair judgments about them. And I think sometimes making the fair judgment doesn't involve looking at the rule directly, or it doesn't just involve appealing to a principle. I think there's something more than that.
So is that the way in which it differs then from interpretivism? Because in a lot of ways it sounds like interpretivism. You're appealing to, there's the rules and the conventions, but you're also appealing to things that are a bit extra to that, mm-hmm. and interpreting those rules and conventions in light of that, whether it's the pursuit of excellence or integrity of the game or something like that. So
right. So part of my disagreement is I think there are plenty of cases where whatever decision is made by these various agents, it just can't be explained by the rules or the principles or an appeal to integrity or a specific excellence of the sport. There's something going on, political ratings. I mean, all of these decisions are made in a variety of ways. That if you just rule out these, in law you would call them non-legal or extra-legal considerations. I think you have something similar in sport, right? When somebody's making an appeal, we like to think that they're only appealing to, say, the rules of the game. But in practice, I don't think that's actually what happens. And so I think we're missing something if we don't try to incorporate those. Admittedly, then that means other considerations start to intrude on sport. Sport no longer is quite the isolated, autonomous venture that we would like it to be. But maybe it's just not.
And maybe it never was.
Yeah, and maybe it never was.
Which takes me to Stephanie. Now you disabused us of many, I think, false or misconceptions about sport in the ancient world. And so what I want to ask you then is which one do you think is the most important misconception that we have that we need to jettison?
I'm glad I disabused you, so thank you. Thank you for
It's
that
better than abusing me. So.
Yes, exactly. The most important misconception is that the difference between the Greeks and Romans was radically good, pure, noble, eternal, timeless on the Greek side, and corrupt, base, mob-based, and other such adjectives on the Roman side. That kind of comparison, besides being historically nonsensible. These are human beings. They're not all good or all bad. They're normal societies in historical moments. But that distinction has played poorly for us, I think, in the West, especially through influences in Northern Europe, where the goodness, purity, eternal truthiness of Greek culture was used by German idealists, and here I'm reporting things I've read, I'm not a student of German philosophy, was used to create an ideology of nation building in Northern Europe and an ideology of the exceptionalism of the German people. So with the folk people. So with a marvelous twist of logical ingenuity, this universalizing concept came to be applied particularly to the burgeoning German state in the 19th century, which then went on to have an unglorious future in the 20th century. So to return us, peeling away European ideology, peeling away, and we'll hear about this in a few minutes, Christian ideology of interpretation, especially of Roman sport, simply helps us get back to the questions of what the Romans thought they were doing, not what we thought they were doing, but what they thought they were doing, what the Greeks thought they were doing. And then we can make judgments about what we think we want to copy and not copy. Not all of it was good, not all of it was pleasant. Some of it was extraordinary. But there is such a thing as academic and historical integrity. In a set of cultures that's so old, the culture that Homer describes in the Iliad and the Odyssey really reflects back to the late Bronze Age, so we're going back 3,000 years. It's not at all surprising that there would be layers of interpretation through all of that period. And our task as contemporary classicists and archaeologists is at least to try not to add more layers, more crust onto the interpretations, but to do our best to peel them away.
Now, some of that misconception of the way the Europeans looked at this difference between the Romans and the Greeks, did the Romans have a conception as well about the difference between themselves and what they were doing in terms of sport and what the Greeks viewed themselves as doing as well?
Yes, the Romans' relationship with the Greeks was complex. When the Romans first met the Greeks, I believe, but I'm fearful I may be wrong, I think it was 300 or 200s, probably the 200s BCE before the Common Era. They did not like what they met. Philosophers came to Rome, Greek philosophers, Athenian philosophers, argued one day on the positive side of an argument, came back the next day, argued the opposite side, and the elder Romans kicked him out of Rome.
Yeah, well, the Greeks didn't like that
they
either,
didn't
right?
Some of them didn't like it either, yeah. But this was going to corrupt Roman values. So they definitely had a mixed relationship. On the other hand, Roman history developed later than Greek history. And so when Rome, in its quite successful territorial expansion, met up with the Hellenistic world, not the classical world of Athens, but met up with the Hellenistic world after Alexander the Great, they're smart enough to know that those folks talked better, wrote better, had a history, had a kind of literature that the Romans didn't have. So they were fully aware of a certain kind of cultural inferiority. Mm-hmm. It took a while for them to develop the Latin language into a tool that could be of world-class level. But they did. And as I said this afternoon, for all the correct attribution of Rome of a great deal of copying of Greek culture, they were nonetheless the only culture in the ancient Mediterranean that succeeded in adopting Greek culture. Now, in terms of sport in particular, the Romans, like many other ancient peoples, thought that running around naked was absurd. Greek nudity in sport. They thought it was unmanly, undignified, ignoble. On the other hand, when the Roman generals, this is after the empire is secure, when the Roman generals went to Athens, they were diplomatic and smart enough to realize that this was a very viable institution, and so they supported it. Mm-hmm. And later on, as the amalgamation of Eastern influences, Greek influences, Roman influences really began to meld through this highly integrated cultural system of the Roman Empire, there were Athenian games in Rome, and there were Roman games through the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, I didn't know that about that. I mean, it's not my area by any stretch, but I didn't realize that there was that much of a distinction between the kind of games that they...
At first, yeah. Now, there were many similarities, but there really are different cultures. What they might have had most in common was horse racing, chariot racing.
One of the things that came up in the discussion period after your talk, questions about fairness, and also... and then this starts to connect to some of what Zach was talking about in terms of religion, is one of the, and I think it might even be I can't say his name, Samson, from Cynthia's talk earlier, where she used him. I think he even puts forward this partly as a thesis, that part of the development of democracy was rooted in these contests, and the equality and fairness, such as it was at that time, as being sort of religiously mandated, that the person who was going to be honored with carrying the torch or being honored by the god for having won, well, we better make sure that this contest is fair, that it's balanced in some way, that we know who really won the race, because this is the person who's going to be honored by the god, so we better make sure that we do this right, and that sort of begins this rooting idea of, well, then the poor person, the rich person can both enter this contest, and if the poor person wins, they win, they're honored by God. So you start to get this sort of procedural justice or procedural fairness idea. So how much do you see of that within Greek, within the Roman cultures, within the games, the interplay with that between democracy and other politics?
A huge question. So we'll see how
you get 2 minutes now.
How much sense I can
30 seconds
in a short time. First, Athens and other city-states were democracies. Rome was a republic, an oligarchic republic. And the leaders lived in a world of voting and rights and before the law, but they did not extend that sense of democracy to the whole. So that's a significant difference. I think it's accurate from what I've read that at the Pan-Hellenic Games, of which there were 4, Olympics were just one, there was a great deal of attention to the judging of the games. There's very clear evidence that there were a lot of judges, and they were carefully trained over months before they would participate. So yes, as respect to the gods, after all, this is a festival, a ritual for Zeus, and we don't want to honor someone who's going to dishonor that ritual, because part of our obligation is to make sure of right relationships between humans and gods. The connection between sport and democracy, as I mentioned this afternoon, is controversial. It's not as unclear, I think might even be fairer. I don't find it, from what I've read, to be as clear as your reporting was said. Other contributions to the development of democracy have to do with changes in the military structure. But a further grounding that I think might be more helpful is, and I didn't talk about this at all this afternoon, it gets more complicated, but there's a concept in the Greek world of the agon, A-G-O-N, of the contest. Our word in English is something that's agonistic. What I've read really very interestingly about that is that concept not only relates to sport, obviously, certainly also to rhetoric. And in one person's, I can't remember the name, I apologize, in one person's hypothesis, it's a Greek concept that precedes even sport or rhetoric, and that it postulates a common community in which excellence can be adjudicated. Really interesting idea to me. In that light, deciding who's best is front and center, or whether it's an argument or a sprint. The opportunity to be best if you weren't an aristocrat changed over time. Mm-hmm. As Greece colonized, when the Greeks left the Aegean area and got as far as Spain, and very early, Spain, Sicily, Northern Africa. And then later on in the empire, when it became more Hellenistic, more and more people who were not Greeks were claiming access. The Olympic Games were closed just to Greek free males. But that began to bend. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could call that democratic. That doesn't mean they could vote.
Right, yeah. But it starts to bring in notions of more equality, more pluralistic sort of society. Not quite equal, but more equal, well, maybe than you were.
Equality is not.
That's our.
Their notion of equality is different from ours. Their notion of equality was equality before the law, mm-hmm. and if you were a citizen, and equality of opportunity to speak in the agora, if you were a citizen. They would not have thought that we were all equal. Right. There's not a sense of natural right. But exposure to other people.
Even in that sense of equality of before the law, but at least maybe even just before this contest. So maybe not in the city-state, but at least within that context.
It becomes possible. And the trajectory of Athenian democracy from Solon down to past Pericles was of a broadening base mm-hmm. within Athens, within the world of the Greeks, and more tightly closed doors to anybody outside. Mm.
Okay, well then I don't have a good transition here, so we'll just transition. Fair enough. to the theology and sport, or theology of sport, and maybe that's where I'll put the question: which is it that you're looking to really energize? A theology of sport, or just theology and sport, where there be maybe an intersection of the disciplines?
Both and.
Okay.
Can I give a non-answer?
Sure.
I do think it's both. I think in the talk I gave, I was trying to sort of articulate that over the course of, in this particular case, I was talking about Christian history. We have various writings and reflections on sport from this Christian perspective that formulate theologies of sport. That said, if we want to look at it more broadly, and as we sort of were talking about interdisciplinarity today, in some ways maybe theology and sport, or as Cindy pointed out, maybe really religion and sport are the frames we need to be talking about. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that I'm on board with that.
Yeah, because there's that question of what do we mean by theology, and that's, I think, right. Synthia brought up that question. Do you mean just Christian theology? But another way to think about it is theology as more akin to, I think you used the term divinity studies versus religious studies, which might be looking more comparatively, more historically, sociologically at various aspects of religion, which is going to be maybe broader than even what we normally think about of religion. and so I don't really have a question in that because it sounds like you're on board with.
I agree.
Now, one point that you discussed, and maybe it's not quite your own view, but I thought it was an interesting claim about the notion of sport as autotelic and driving its own meaning, and that these other sort of endeavors, whether it's professionalization, commercialization of sport, or other uses of sport, undermine it, make it instrumental. That sounds. What I thought was interesting about that was just how almost verbatim that sounds like your standard sort of secular critique within the Academy of Sport, whether typically coming from critical or leftist sort of or perspectives. So I thought that was interesting as a parallel that they seem to be making the same critique. I don't know if you've thought about that at all. What you think about that now that I've said that?
Yeah, that particular commentator on sport, Lincoln Harvey.
Yes.
That's
I couldn't remember his name. So
that's the thesis of his book.
Okay.
Is sort of deals with that. I'm sympathetic. I don't know that I 100% agree. Yeah, I do think in many ways, though, if we look at sport as purely autotelic, right? If we participate in it and we do so purely for its own sake, for the joy in participation, the ends are in itself, sort of. I think if that is what we value in sport, if that is the sporting ideal, then I think it is logical, right, to sort of view anything that instrumentalizes sport. We need to be suspicious of it because it's sort of abusing the telos of sport, which is the ends are in itself, right? Mm-hmm. So the moment the telos is rooted elsewhere, that sport is sullied. Mm-hmm. It's like impure now.
Which kind of takes us full circle back to interpretivism and legal realism, because in a sense, maybe what you're saying is there really isn't a telos here. That there might be in certain cases, but there isn't a broad, shared, universal telos. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think more or less. I mean, that's been the challenge from the conventionalist or the traditionalist or whatever label you want to put on that sort of more relativist tradition, which has been very critical of these other views of sport, to say you're acting as if there's some telos, there's some essence, there's some ideal form of excellence, and I guess I'm sort of on board with that critique. Only I don't want to stop it there, right? Just because we might be skeptical of this essence of sport shouldn't necessarily lead us to only saying sport is just what it is. But I think that part of the critique is it's important to latch onto at least part of that.
Finding some balance there.
Well, I think you were mentioned. I remember we mentioned baseball in the question and answer session, and I think I was thinking of a connection between all three. Was in my sports writer class, we were having a discussion and about those unwritten rules of baseball and how do you respond to if you're shown up. You know, like say a batter hits a home run and shows up the pitcher. You're like, well, next time he said it's the pitcher's job to throw him next time because you don't do that. And I'm like, well, why is that? That's the written rule. And I'm thinking, and I said to him, is he really that insecure that he has to throw the ball at him because the guy hit a home run? But that I think is connected to this idea. If we see this sport as something noble, and we refer to the fields as cathedrals, right? I mean, that kind of almost pastoral kind of quality to baseball. I wonder if we can look beyond that, then we can question that. But otherwise, if maybe I don't know if those unwritten rules are a way to kind of respond to when the game is not ideal, because in an ideal game, no one would ever show it. It's completely, so the minute someone shows up, is it a way you have to balance it out? Is it some sort of cosmic, I don't know, it just seemed to be, there was something, because they didn't want to grasp that there was anything other than it was manly, and it was the right thing to do, and it was connected to the tradition of the game, rather than it might come from a different place. And what does that mean? But I think there's I was just thinking, Stephanie, of your ideas of even kind of demystifying the kind of grandiose language that we connected to. I don't know.
Yeah. My response is just the proper response to a guy showing you up because he hit a home run is to strike him out next time.
Yeah,
throw it.
Well,
Strike him out.
Yeah, strike him.
Do a better job.
Right, but it does. I think as you're saying, I mean, there becomes this tension in trying to figure out how to evaluate the rules from externally, and if there is. Which I think is the pull towards trying to find the telos, because if you can have a kind of telos, or you have a kind of Macatarian sort of practice that defines the telos for you, then you can have this way of evaluating whether it has integrity or not. But I think it's important too to push that that's not always the way it really is working, and not in the sense that it's falling short of the ideal. It's just a different kind of thing that's going on there.
I mean, I really think that the unwritten rules, especially in baseball, which obviously has the most of these bizarre unwritten, I mean, that seems to really be motivating, at least I see it as motivating all of these big philosophical questions that emerge, because there's this tradition of sports are games, and games are about rules, and that's the end of the story. And unwritten rules clearly mess up the analysis. So then what do we make of them? Do we just say, well, they're there, that's it? That doesn't seem right. So I think there's been various movements to try to work those in. Well, how can unwritten rules be a part of the sport if they're not written down? Like, who knows what they are, and where do you find them? And so
Although that does push back to the question of philosophy of law, because you do have a common law tradition, which in a way is like that. There are these set of unwritten rules that you apply to the legal situation and interpret it, even though they're not written down, and you're not in some cases you don't state them until the case comes up, and you need to state them.
And this is why I think we find so many parallels between umpires and referees and judges, and lots of people have written on this in a variety of ways, and there seem to be plenty of examples where they're doing the same thing, and plenty of examples where they're doing something differently, and then people have different ideas of, well, here's what a good judge or umpire does.
How much is consistency valued? Like the strike zone can change, but if it's the same through 9 innings, and it's the same, but it's
right. And how much should we be? I mean, I think as I look at it, I think part of the real discussion comes down to, should we be focusing on what judges and umpires ought to do, or should we just be focusing on what umpires and judges actually do? And can those come together at any point? And I guess I'm sort of skeptical that they go together as much as it would be nice if they went together. But.
Yeah, I think there's got to be some balance there, because you can't just do one or the other. But how they come together, that's another question. So we'll solve that over some beer and scotch and sushi. So unfortunately the folks in the podcast world can't join us for that. But thank you so much for being a part of the symposium today.
Thank you for hosting both of you.
Yes.
This has been the Sports Ethics Show. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.